U.S. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin have held a high-stakes phone call, and they discussed Ukraine, along with a host of other issues. Both Biden and Putin indicated support for further diplomacy on the tense standoff between Russia and Ukraine. Now, CGTN's Owen Fairclough reports.
US President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin tried to stress going into this hour-long call that it was fairly routine between these two leaders, the second conversation they've had this month. But there's nothing routine about the prospect of some 100,000 Russian troops amassed along Ukraine's eastern border and raising the specter of an all-out ground invasion of Ukraine, a crisis not just for the NATO military alliance, but for many neighboring countries around that region as well. So there was great impetus for both sides to try and de-escalate the tensions that have been building in recent weeks between Russia and Ukraine. This call was initiated by the Russian president, the White House saying that this hour-long conversation was a good opportunity to try and engage in some diplomacy. But there are many, many difficult issues to address here, namely Russia's demand for the United States to stop Ukraine becoming a member of the NATO alliance and moving ever closer to the West. That's a no-go area for the United States, which has always said that any country is entitled to apply for NATO membership. But there is some critical timing involved here. There's not just a NATO meeting in the new year, but also another meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ukraine might not be a member of NATO, but both Russia and Ukraine are members of the OSCE. So you would have the very awkward optics of representatives of these countries getting around the table to discuss these issues without any clear resolution. So Russia was looking for some commitments from the United States, but the White House has been keen to state that it wants conditions of its own, namely that it sees evidence of Russia withdrawing those troops along Ukraine's borders. There are plenty of other topics for these leaders to talk about as well, namely Iran's nuclear program and those ongoing allegations that Russia continues to attempt to rig elections, not just here in the United States, but around the world as well. And yet Ukraine needs its own commitments from the United States. Will it come to Ukraine's rescue should there be a military conflict? The US has been less keen to stress that, but says it will come to Ukraine's aid when it comes to providing things like military support. It's already provided billions of dollars for things like missile defense and cybersecurity as well. But the timing for these two countries to have this phone call is important, with these two critical meetings lined up for these countries to talk over their issues in the weeks to come.
Well, the meeting between Putin and Biden is their second conversation this month. Here is a bit more about why they are talking so often.
Both conversations between the U.S. and Russian presidents have focused on Ukraine. Biden wants Russia to withdraw some of the troops stationed near its border with Ukraine, while Putin wants assurances that NATO stop its expansion into Eastern Europe. No one is willing to take the first step. In the latest call, Biden reiterated his threat of unprecedented sanctions if Russia chose to invade Ukraine. Putin said that any sanctions now or later could lead to a complete breakdown in ties. The tone of the call was described by officials on both sides as serious, and neither country detailed significant progress towards a resolution or the outlines of any deal. Earlier this week, the United States deployed its surveillance and target attack military plane in Ukrainian airspace for the first time. Tensions over the Ukraine began in 2014. Former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych rejected an agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Moscow. That sparked mass protests in the former Soviet Republic, which then led to his ouster. Russia responded by incorporating Crimea following a local referendum that was rejected by Kyiv. The ensuing fighting left more than 14,000 people dead. In 2015, a peace agreement was brokered by France and Germany. But earlier this year, a spike in ceasefire violations in the east and a Russian troop buildup near Ukraine fueled new fears of war. Earlier this month, U.S. intelligence officials said Russia plans to deploy an estimated 175,000 troops, with almost half of them already stationed along various points near Ukraine's border. Russia hasn't provided any details about its troop numbers and locations, saying deployment on its own territory shouldn't concern anyone. Biden and Putin have agreed to prepare for lower-level talks in January.
Now, to discuss more on this, we're now joined by current affairs commentator Aina Tangen in the studio and Moscow-based defense analyst Pavel Felgenhauer via Skype. Welcome to Global War, gentlemen. Well, first of all, a question to both of you. Interestingly, the U.S. and the Russian spokespersons after talks sounded very calm about the talk, but as we know, the two leaders exchanged warnings and even threats. So how do you see the outcome of this phone call? Do you think it's pragmatic enough? Aina first.
Okay, well, there's two ways of thinking about it. Either this is a very, very serious issue and they're pretending to be calm because they're on the verge of something, or this is posturing for a series of meetings that's going to be starting after the 9th. It's going to be talking different parties, the U.S., etc. We'll be talking about this issue. I would tend to see it as the first. Things are very serious. There's a lot of threats. This is an area where you need statesmen, and we unfortunately have a lot of populist posturing.
Right, and Mr. Felgenhauer, how do you see the outcome of the talks? Do you think it's substantive?
Well, that was a serious exchange of views. That's very good. Apparently, Russian president was actually trying to project that this on President Biden, that this is a very serious issue, that Russia is not just simply posturing, that this is a life and death situation as Russia sees it, and that the United States should very seriously engage in negotiations that are coming in January, that this is a serious issue. That's what the Kremlin is saying, that this was serious negotiations, and that is a good sign that maybe seriously talking, we could achieve something in the future.
Right, and Aina, U.S. actually really threatened Russia by saying if you invade Ukraine, then you will see sanctions in a scale that you've never seen. So what's exactly Washington's position on the Ukraine disputes? That serious?
Well, it sounds like the tired old record. I mean, they've said this about Cuba, they've said this about Iran, they've said this about Venezuela, China, Russia already. It's always double secret probation. We're going to come after you. So it's not clear. But what is clear is that Biden has made a separation, which is making Ukraine uneasy, that there will not be military intervention, that it'll be economic retaliation.
Right, and Russia's deputy foreign minister has compared Moscow's standoff with the West over Ukraine to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's a very serious comparison. That was the most, as we all know, dangerous Cold War confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union that brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war even. So, Mr. Felgenhauer, do you see the diplomatic and military tensions between Russia and the US as tense as the Cuban missile?
Well, actually, there were other crises during the Cold War, like Berlin crisis, the Korean War, the 73 crisis in the Middle East, the 83 crisis in Europe, over able Archer exercises of NATO. So it's not just because the Cuban Missile Crisis was a serious crisis. Russia sees it's kind of a lot of similarities. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which could hit targets in the United States, giving the Soviet Union a capability it didn't have really before. And right now, Moscow believes that the United States it may be planning to deploy missiles in Ukraine or maybe in Romania, Poland, the Baltics, that will be targeting Moscow and other strategic points within Russia. And Moscow says that this is a very grave issue, a very grave threat, and Russia, like the United States, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they imposed a naval blockade and prepared a full-scale invasion, Russia could also use a military force or the threat of direct use of military force to prevent such a situation. So it's much closer to the Cuban Missile Crisis than any other Cold War crisis during all those years.
Right, and real progress or not, this talk between Biden and Putin is seen by many as a good sign of making further diplomatic efforts in solving the Ukraine issue. But is really any way out for the disputes over Ukraine, indeed? Gentlemen?
Well, I think that it has to be behind closed doors. This kind of political posturing and populism, both sides appealing to their domestic basis, is not good. But we have an asymmetrical situation here. For Putin, it's very simple. He wants security assurances for his nation. For Biden, it's also very simple. He wants to win the next midterm elections.
That's very pragmatic, isn't it? Mr. Faulkenhauer, how do you see any way out for the dispute over Ukraine?
It won't be an easy way to find a way out because, well, from Moscow point of view, it's believed that the United States fully controls Ukrainian government, that means we don't actually need to talk to Ukrainians. They are kind of vassals of Washington. We talk directly to the masters in Washington, which actually is not fully so at all. Ukraine has its own internal politics, and also the United States has internal politics. You can't just simply agree with the White House if it would be believed that the White House is selling out Ukraine in any kind of way. There would be a backlash inside the United States and from Congress. So it's a very complicated situation. I believe the best the sides could achieve is some kind of freeze of the present situation for the foreseeable future to avoid actually getting on a slippery slope into a almost war situation. Because when Russia says it's going to sever relations, in the modern world, that means you're kind of moving on to a war footing. That's a very serious threat, and that should be avoided by all means.
Indeed. Well, we'll keep observing the situation on the disputes over Ukraine as both sides apparently are calculating the situation. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Ina Tangen, the current affairs commentator, and Moscow-based defense analyst Pavel Faulkenhauer via Skype. Thank you very much for your insights.